What's up, Dragon Brood? Did y'all know that the fear of being afraid is called phobophobia? Yeah, I didn't either, but it's one of the many things I ended up researching while trying to figure out what are all the fears, phobias, and tropes type things that were included in Duskmourn. And there's quite a lot. So, before we get into it, I want to cover a couple of quick things. One, these are all terms I had to learn and research, so I'm going to do my best pronouncing them. I don't know if I'm going to get them all right. Give me some grace there. I'm doing the best I can. Some of these are wild words. The other is I tried to mostly include the things where an item was being depicted in a fearful manner or in a way that if somebody had that fear would find that scary, if that made sense. So we didn't really include literally every single thing because technically, I mean, any picture of a thing could have something that has a fear. So where it was referenced or the artwork made it a thing, I tried to include it. So anyway, let's hop in. We'll start with the first one, which is fear of abduction. And this one's kind of straightforward. It's just abductophobia. Yeah, that one. Some of these are easy, so we'll get those right. And then we have fear of immobility, which is marinthophobia. But the closest I could find wasn't really immobility. It's something that referenced being tied or bound, which is kind of the same thing, so I included it. And then there's fear of surveillance, which was scopophobia. And it was mostly of like being stared at, which is, I guess, the same thing. But this comes up, I believe, with a later term toward the end of the video, and we'll reference kind of how some things are similar, but there's different terminologies when you get specific within a certain phobia. And there were enough ghosts in the set that I figured it was worth mentioning. So, phasmophobia, which, if you've played the video game that kind of got popular during the pandemic, like you sort of know about this already, but there you go. Unidentified hovership, which is obviously an alien hovercraft of some kind. Well, this one was a little weird because there's, I believe the term I have in my notes here is UFObia and alien phobia, or alienophobia, which neither of those is very clean. It's just kind of what I could find on Google through the internet, but not to be confused with astrophobia, which is kind of just like the fear of space, or xenophobia can be used, which people use as a fear of aliens, but due to, I guess, political climate of things, that kind of gets referred to people being from other countries, so doesn't get used in the same way as much. But it's an actual phobia, just has some weird terminology. Unsettling twins. Didymophobia. Yeah, this one I think originated probably because of The Shining, is the most references I could find. Believe it or not, that's actually a thing that was quoted. So I guess The Shining made a bunch of people afraid of twins. This next one's kind of creepy, but a fear of eyes. I believe it was a emetophobia. And this had to do with eyes in a lot of different varieties, and it's has some other different types of terminology at times, talking about specific body parts, but we'll also get into some of those others throughout this video. Oh, and at this point, going through the research, I decided I should include a couple of rooms because one of the obvious ones is claustrophobia, when you're talking about locked rooms and unlocked rooms, and I thought that was worth including, but basically a fear of enclosed or tight spaces. So I thought it was worth including, even though I didn't think we had an actual card called claustrophobia. I think it was still worth talking about. Oh, and this is what I actually didn't know, even though I'd watched a lot of Shark Week, but fear of sharks is galleophobia. So that's a fun one to use when that comes up again. Fear of failed test is a card that actually led me down a rabbit hole a little bit because I couldn't find a thing that's actually a fear of failed test. Though there is a fear of failing, and that's kind of what we went with here. And my notes have aticophobia. Yeah, that's a weird term. I've never heard of it, but apparently it's a real thing. It's just a fear of failure. So I guess this applies here. Oh, and if you ever had one of those weird dreams where you fall off of something and you're just freaked out about it for days, yeah, fear of falling is a thing. It's bassophobia. That's another one I didn't know. And then we had fear of imposters, and I was trying to find a terminology for a fear of like people just not being themselves, I guess, but I couldn't really find a thing. The closest thing we had was just a fear of you being an imposter, which we just referred to as imposter syndrome. It's not really classified as a phobia, but definitely a realistic fear that people have, so it made the list. And oh my gosh, this next one, I have to just read from my notes because I had to break this one down, very difficult. But a fear of isolation is known as autophobia, but can also be broken down into three other types of phobias known as monophobia, isolophobia, and eremophobia. Never heard of those, but here we are. Like, this is why we do these types of videos. And the closest thing I could find to a fear of drowning was thalassophobia, but it kind of more refers to a fear of deep water or oceans or whatever, because they can lead to a fear of drowning or the things in the water. But the more I thought about it, I'd never really considered why so many things that reference water or blue in Magic were thalassa something or thassa something, so maybe this is where they derived the words from. So yeah, now you know. Yeah, I'm going to be referencing my notes a lot because there were so many things here, but in this particular one, we actually have a fear of mirrors, which was spectrophobia, but that could also apply to ghost or particularly ghost or beings in mirrors. But then they also had catoptrophobia and isoptrophobia, which was your self-reflection that you're afraid of. So fear of mirrors and reflections can get pretty complicated and pretty deep depending on your specific phobia. So this was kind of interesting, and they did include a couple of cards with mirrors in the set, which I thought was kind of cool. A fear of crabs, which is carubophobia, which is interesting because now I think about things that sound like that in various games, and they happen to all be crabs, so that's one to know. And then this one I couldn't really find an exact thing for, but the closest thing I could find is a fear of silence referred to as sedatophobia. So yeah, I'm not sure if that would apply to the not having the ability to scream, I guess, if that's a recurring weird dream that you have, but in this case, it's the closest thing we got. These next two just apply to monsters, so fear of vampires, sanguivorophobia, I think I got that right, and the fear of demons, oddly, is just demonophobia. I couldn't really find a fear of lost teeth, but there was a fear of dental stuff or dental processes or dental operations, which goes under, well, quite simply, dentophobia. Fear of the dark, I have to go back and reference my notes because there's like 3 different things it could be. It could be nyctophobia, which kind of makes sense already if you understand word entomology. And then there's acluophobia and lygophobia, all deriving from various Greek words having to do with midnight, darkness, that type of stuff. So they all kind of fit, and I don't know why they all exist. I don't know medically how many of them are used over the other ones, but I figured I would include all of them. Of course, there's fear of the dead, which is necrophobia, and a fear of rats, which is musophobia, which is cute because that word almost looks like mouse. Oh, and the fear of injections or infections from, I guess, just anything. I was trying to think of something to compare it to, but the most general term was fear of infections or of infectious illness, which is nosophobia. Which is interesting because of all the recent pandemic stuff. That's not a term I heard come up, but now we know it's a thing. Fear of chainsaws was an interesting one because it's kind of a subset of another one, and we'll come back to that later. But since it was here in order, it's Kayamaphobia or Kameaphobia, I believe is how you pronounce that. There you go. I think we got it right the second time. And then we have the fear of monkeys, or actually monkeys and apes, which is Pithecophobia, which is an interesting term that I also feel like I should have heard before, but I haven't. Oh, and then there's a fear of televisions or of watching television, which you're not going to believe this, but it's actually televisophobia. That's the term. I'm not making this up. Fear of being haunted is a fun one with diocophobia, which that one was a kind of cool term. And then we have the fear of being burned alive. Now, this could fall under a few things because there's obviously pyrophobia, which is the fear of fire, but then there's also enclosures, which was an interesting term, or honestly, burnmophobia. So multiple different ways this could be classified, I guess, depending on the type of concern with the fire, I would assume, but I figured I'd include all 3 terms because they all kind of made sense. Oh, and then this was an interesting one. Fear of missing out got included in the set. And it's a thing that everybody acknowledges, and there were several different writings about it, but there's no actual term for this. And it kind of confused me because on the one hand I thought as much as we talk about it that there would be a classification of a term by now, but then as it turns out everybody just uses the term FOMO, like for real. So that's it. Like, this is the most disappointing one on the list. Oh, this was an interesting one. A fear of glass or of breaking glass is hyalophobia. Now, this is one I feel like also should have come up at some point, but this is a cool one to kind of put away in your memory. I feel like this should be like a trivia question somewhere down the line. A fear of hands is known as chirophobia. And the interesting thing about this one, the research I found says it kind of derives from people having some type of hand injury or arthritis or whatever, and then it leads to some of these types of phobias that are related, which I found kind of interesting. Oh, the fear of pigs. This was another simple one. It's swiniophobia, and just looks like it has the word swine in it, so that one makes sense. Oh my gosh, and then when I came across this, I saw the roller coaster ride, knew obviously there had to be a fear of roller coasters. I have never heard this term. It is Velox. I don't even know if I could say this. I even tried to practice this as I wrote it down. But veloxrotophobia. That is a weird term for roller coasters. And I'm sure there's word etymology there having to do with that. But yeah, the other thing is too, it actually is often referred to as just coaster phobia. So there's that, if you want a simpler term. Fear of clowns, I actually knew this one, which is coulrophobia. And interesting thing, I knew somebody who was allergic to clowns, and one of the things his therapist had him do was go to clown college, which is an actual thing that exists, so he could learn all the ins and outs of being a clown from the other side, and it actually cured his fear of clowns. So don't know if you have a fear of clowns or not, but hey, that's one path you could go down. Oh yeah, this is that thing, one of the things I referenced earlier in the video. So we have a fear of exposure, which kind of also fell under a fear of surveillance, but not quite the same thing, but they do get classified in the same categories. So there's a few different terms I could apply to this. So since we already had the fear of surveillance, I went a little deeper, and we have spotligectophobia with a G in there. And this is interesting because it almost looks like the word spotlight, which kind of makes sense. But then there's also ophthalmophobia, which doesn't look like that at all. But either way, these are both terms that can go along with the other that could actually work for this as well. So depending on the condition that you have, or I guess the type of specific surveillance or viewing of yourself you have an issue with, one of these could apply. Fear of insects, this is a fairly common one that I think is known, but entomophobia. And a fear of fungus is mycophobia, which is cool because when I started thinking about magic cards that were myco something, and it kind of makes sense. And this also could apply to fungus or mold, so not just one or the other. It's kind of everything within that class. Oh, and another one I need to toss in here that I almost left out is a fear of dolls, which is pediophobia, which would make you think it's fear of kids, but actually it kind of makes sense because dolls are for children, so I guess that's where that comes from. Oh, and a fear of spiders is obviously popular enough they got a movie about it back in, I think it was the 90s. So, arachnophobia. But I think that's one of the more common fears that people know about already. Oh, and the fear of infinity. This is a thing that came up on one of my streams, and I actually had to look it up then, but I believe the term we found is a periophobia. But not just for infinity, but kind of like just the vastness of things, like the endless universe and things that are too big to grasp, I guess, in number, sort of thing. So yeah, that's a pretty real and common fear, as it turns out. Oh, and this is one I actually looked not knowing if it was a fear, but a fear of furnaces is fornasophobia. And it comes from, I guess, furnaces in some cases being depicted as monsters with like all the fiery light and stuff, but also being a bit of danger that people are afraid of, either falling into or burning themselves or just exploding. So yeah, apparently more common than I thought. Oh, and as much zombie stuff as there is out there, I would have assumed I would have known about this next term, but I believe it's kinemorphophobia, which is a fear of zombies. And I don't think, and maybe I just don't watch enough zombie movies, but I don't think I've ever heard that term used. So yeah, now there's a thing you could throw around in your like horror movie groups. Yeah, this next one I also feel like I should have heard before because it's a fear of medical or surgical procedures, and it's tomophobia, which is a very simple term for that, which kind of surprised me, but it's a thing. Oh, and amusingly, I knew as soon as I saw it and I went to look it up, I knew the fear of vacuums was going to be a thing, but this is a term I would have never guessed it would have been if you gave me 50 guesses. But I believe it's swigerophobia, which is, or swigerphobia. Swigerphobia, I think is with a Z, which is very strange. But yeah, a fear of vacuums or hoovering, as it actually is classified, which I guess is just sucking stuff up in some way. But yeah, that's an interesting one. Oh, and yeah, that part where I was talking about the chainsaw being part of a subclass of other things, well, you can have a fear of saws, which is trianogophobia, but then you have a fear of chainsaws and then other types of saws underneath it. So yeah, there's a higher classification, and then there's just the chainsaws. So yeah, there you go. So we're just getting educated today. So needless to say, they covered a lot of different fears, phobias, all kinds of stuff in Duskmourn. So credit to R&D and the Wizards for getting all that right and giving us a reason to go learn some terms that we probably wouldn't have learned any other time being a Magic player, because there's no reason for us to know a lot of this. But that said, was there something that you thought they would have included in the set? Because there's probably a few. Or is there just more stuff if we go back to Duskmourn that they can use? Or did I get any of these wrong? Because, you know, this is just quick research to try to figure this out and make a fun video for you. But either way, if you want to know more about Duskmourn, don't forget to watch my other videos where we're going to be covering all types of stuff about your underrated cards, things you could craft, not craft. Don't forget to like, subscribe, all that fun stuff so you don't miss that. But that's all I have for you for now. We'll see you next time.